It's my great pleasure to moderate this morning's panel focusing on the regulators. So with that said, why don't we just get right to it, and I'm going to ask our esteemed panelists to introduce ourselves, representing both the OCC and the Federal Trade Commission, and let me start with Paul.
Great. Good morning, everybody. How we doing? Good morning, everybody. How we doing? Good, thanks. So I'm Paul Reymann. I'm the Director of Consumer Compliance Policy at the Office of Controller of the Currency. And just to give you a little bit of perspective of my background, I've been in this space either as a regulator in the private sector for over 30 years. I spent now about 15 years as a regulator and about 15 years in the private sector, where I had several companies that were involved in data security and compliance and regulatory help, both for technology companies and for banks. So the perspective that I'm going to share with you today is not only from the OCC, but also from my personal experiences with a blend of being where many of you are today and being both in and out of the public sector. But before we get started into that, my kids, I have two beautiful daughters, and for 21 and 19 years, they've been asking me, Dad, what do you do for a living? We really don't understand this. So I like to show them, and since we're all able to use our phones and take pictures during this event, I'm going to ask everybody to stand up, if you don't mind. Come on, stand up. And I got to post this on Facebook later, okay? Thanks, appreciate it. I'll send that to them. You'll probably see it later on social media. So thank you. And I'm happy to be surrounded by lawyers because I'm the only one up here that I think's not a lawyer.
I'm Duane Pozza. Can you hear me? Duane Pozza. I'm an assistant director in financial practices at the Federal Trade Commission. My son is 1.5, so even if I took a selfie, I don't think he would really care much about that unless it had Thomas the Train in it or something like that. I have to give the disclaimer: the views that I give today are those of mine alone, and not the views of the commission or any commissioner. The division that I oversee at the federal, or that I work in the Federal Trade Commission, deals with financial practices, and generally at the FTC we deal with non-bank institutions across the economy, and that includes non-bank financial institutions and a lot of the companies that are innovating in fintech and regtech. And so that's the perspective from which we see this landscape.
Okay, so the lead into the first topic in question, let me just give you a little bit of historical perspective. So when I joined the CFPB in 2012, that agency was a brand new agency that had been in operation for about a year. And when I was there for a little over 2 years until the end of 2014, I don't think I heard the word fintech uttered more than once in the 2+ years that I was there. And there was certainly no formal working group or initiative or strategic priority focusing on regtech or fintech at that time. Kind of informally, nerds like me gravitated at the Bureau, and we had kind of what I would say is an informal working group focusing on these issues, people in enforcement, in supervision, and in rulemaking, and in markets. And just a little connection there, it was at the Bureau where I first met Duane, and he was my counterpart at the Trade Commission when the two agencies were coordinating on the mobile cramming cases involving unauthorized charges on your phone bills, with all 4 major carriers entering into consent orders with some combination of the Trade Commission, the Bureau, and the FCC, as well as all 50 states, the District of Columbia as well. So it was an exciting time, but I say that to say that was a long time ago. So much has changed, and in financial services, people always talk about what's your track record, what does performance look like your last 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, and they use it as an indicator to look forward. I don't think that's the case in what we're talking about here today. So we can talk about what's going on today, we can talk about what's happened in the past, but I think the challenge for all of us is to kind of extrapolate that and try to apply it to what we're doing and looking forward. And I think that's the great challenge today. And we have here 2 people that are very much in the trenches at their respective agencies, focusing on technology and innovation. And so I think that the primary and first question should be, please, Paul and Duane, tell us about what you and your agencies have been doing and are doing with respect to, and I'm not going to cabin it off to any particular thing, fintech, reg tech, whatever it may be. I'm going to open it up, and my kind of general term is anything involving innovation and change, right? So Paul, tell us, at the OCC, what are you guys doing? What are you guys thinking about?
Sure. So we've been a little busy for the last 2 years, maybe closer to 2.5 years. Since I came back to the agency, there was an initiative started soon after I came back. One of our top strategic priorities under Controller Curry, who's now stepped down after his term ended. And during that strategic initiative, we were focusing on what we call responsible innovation. And it's consistent with our mission to ensure that the industry is operating in a safe, sound manner, and it's ensuring fair access to financial services and fair treatment to customers. And we engaged with a number of companies, trade associations, community groups, academia, and others in several conversations over several months at the beginning to research and understand what's going on out in the industry. Because you kept hearing about it, but we wanted to get better eyes on what really the facts were and what some of the business models were and the partnership opportunities between fintech and the financial services industry, or banks and non-banks, as we refer to frequently. So through that process, we realized, we're getting a lot of really good information, and we need to share this. We need to create more outreach so that others can benefit from this information. And I think many of you, if you've been tracking what we've been doing, back in March of last year, 2016, we published a paper. We thought about how do we get this message out, and we decided, let's just articulate it and give our perspective on what we see as responsible innovation in financial services. And so we published this paper back in March. We got over 100 comments on that paper, very productive dialogue through that comment process. It was informal. And then we decided, let's not stop. Let's bring people together into a forum, which we were pleasantly surprised how quickly this forum sold out. It was free, but we were limited to 350 seats in this auditorium. And within 48 hours, we had 350 participants from around the world, domestically, internationally, from all those groups that I just mentioned that we had reached out to and interviewed. And for an entire day, we shared our perspective and listened to feedback from the participants. And that's recorded and archived on our website if you go check out our Responsible Innovation page on occ.gov. Next, we decided, through this process, we started to identify the need for a framework around this whole subject matter and what we need to do internally as an agency to school up our resources, our examiners, our business lines, as well as how can we continue to open the dialogue and keep it going with industry, both banks and non-banks, with us, as well as with other regulators, and for banks and non-banks to engage more easily and more successfully with each other. So we've created, in December of last year, the Office of Innovation, which is now headed up by Beth Knickerbocker, our Chief Innovation Officer. And Beth was with me for that period of time during the development of our paper on our perspective and creating this framework. And she's very sharp, and she's very approachable in terms of what we're experiencing and what's going on from the banking industry side in terms of the regulations, as well as we're seeing a lot of business models that can be great opportunities for banks and non-banks to partner together. So where we are today is that office is open for business. We're engaging in conversations on a continuing basis. I'm in at least 2 meetings a week, or invited to 2 meetings a week, where companies are coming in to talk to us about the regulatory environment, what they're doing, how they think they can help in financial services, enabling fair treatment, enabling fair access, better lending, better payments. We could go down the list. we held our first after hours, which is a theme we borrowed from the CFPB, our colleagues at the CFPB, where in San Francisco and New York, we hold regular after-hour meetings that last for 2 days. And our first one was, I think, about 2 weeks ago. We had over 22 companies come through those after-hour meetings, and they got to tell their story and get a little taste of what the rules of the road are for the regulatory environment. So the one theme I like to share with people, to put a wrapper on this part of the question, really is, if you're going to engage in financial services, you need to think and operate like a regulated entity, because financial services is regulated by the activity for the most part. And there's other regulations that apply, like BSA, anti-money laundering. We go down the list on the alphabet regs of consumer protection for lending or payments, data security. All of this applies. So the cost of doing business in financial services is to think and operate like a regulated entity. And if one of your strategies is to partner with a bank, the bank's going to require that of you as well. And that's why our third-party risk management guidance has gotten so much attention over the last several years, because that's really a recipe for how to start your conversations and prepare yourself for partnering with banks. So more to come. We have a new acting controller, as many of you may or may not know, acting controller Narika. And I was fortunate enough to have a briefing with him a couple weeks ago on this issue, and we weren't sure whether he was going to continue to push this forward or not. And he said, "This is a good thing. You know, we need to continue down this path." He'll be giving official comments on that later this month. I can't get out ahead of what he's going to say, but I was very encouraged by his perspective on this and how it ties in with the new administration strategy.
Paul, two quick follow-up questions. So Comptroller Curry, many people in your agency have really been kind of making the rounds, so to speak, to encourage people to talk to your Office of Innovation. So very practically, how does someone get a meeting? How does someone get a conversation? They contact you, or?
They come up and see me afterwards, and I got handed these cards as I walked out the door last night. The Office of Innovation has made it very easy. You can go to our website and look for the Office of Innovation page, and there's an email, there's a barcode you could scan and submit your request. They may follow up with an email, they may follow up with a phone call to learn more about what actually you want to talk about. But if as many as I have, I'll hand out to folks who are interested. This is an easy card. You could call me. I'm always happy to talk to folks. You know, I've been where you are, so I love those conversations, but it's going to be more efficient and less friction in the process in terms of handoffs and emails if you just reach out to them directly. They have a team that's focused just on facilitating meetings and bringing the right people to the table.
With Duane's patience, one other follow-up. A lot of people in the room are not banks, right? They may partner with banks, provide services with banks. Will you meet with non-banks?
So yes, short answer is yes. And by matter of practice, the majority of these meetings that we've been having are with non-banks. And they're with companies, fintech companies, regtech companies that have either already partnered with banks, or they're trying to understand how to partner with banks, or they're just trying to understand the landscape better because they feel they can provide a value add to the financial services industry. And so, yes, absolutely.
Okay. Excellent. It's interesting to hear that most of the meetings are with non-banks. All right, so let me turn it over to
Paul, we've already had an infrastructure in here for decades to communicate with banks. We communicate with them during exams, quarterly phone calls, multiple outreach events at the state, national level. So the new aspect is really the non-bank entities and making it easy for them. So.
Right, and
Thanks.
just to remind people, many of you probably know this, that the OCC and a lot of the prudential regulators in the CFPB have statutory authority to examine bank service providers as well as the banks. So turning over to Duane, and I'll just preface this, you know, the Trade Commission, I think, has been ahead of the curve in this area. They've been dealing with a lot of these tech and innovative issues for years, I think, before it became a formalized agenda or topic for some of the other agencies. So With that, I'm going to turn over to Duane and let him talk about what he's been doing.
Thanks. I do think the FTC over the past couple decades has really put an emphasis on trying to drive the discussion and learn as much as possible about the way that technological innovation is affecting consumers' lives. I'm from the consumer protection piece of the FTC. There's also the competition side. But we have had workshops starting with, I think, really the rise of e-commerce and the web a whole 2 decades ago to figure out what the consumer implications of the technology is. And because we're a pro-consumer agency, it's both the benefits and the potential risks. We always want to encourage innovation for the benefit of consumers, and whenever we take the agency takes enforcement action, it's always weighing the possible downsides of discouraging innovation before it takes an enforcement action. So to drill down on that a little bit more, over the last few years, as fintech, first I think really mobile payments as the entree to this wider world of fintech, has evolved and pushed more and more into the non-bank sector, which is what we have jurisdiction over. We have focused on it more. Over the last year, we had a fintech forum series that was 3 different open to the public meetings where we had panelists come and talk about the potential benefits and risks for consumers of different areas of fintech. So we covered marketplace lending, we covered peer-to-peer payments, we covered crowdfunding, we covered artificial intelligence and blockchain, which are really things that are hard for people to even get their idea around the technology itself before even getting to the potential consumer implications of it. So it's very exciting. We try to do as much as we can internally to make sure that we hire technologists who understand and can interface with companies. We always encourage companies to really just call us, and I'm going to actually try and steal, Paul, your idea about the card, because that will make it much easier, but because I think it's great. But basically, we do meet with folks, and we also try to do outreach and connection with the forums that we do. We also are an enforcement agency, and I'll talk a little more about that as we go on. But when we are bringing enforcement actions, it's for the benefit of consumers, right? Where we enforce mostly unfair and deceptive acts and practices laws. So we're really making sure that consumers are treated well, they're not deceived, they're not injured, and those are the kinds of things that we focus on when we look at the industry.
Tell us a little bit about I forget what the guy's title is, the Chief Technology Officer, your in-house technology expert, who I think you hired about a year ago. Tell us a little bit about him and his background and how you work with him.
So we have actually a rotating Chief Technology Officer, usually drawn from academia, and I think it might not be filled right now. It might be in between folks. And they're very helpful. They have a lot of autonomy, actually, to write about the things and explore the consumer issues that they want, that are not driven by what someone on a staff level is seeing. A lot of the work that's been done at the FTC over the last few years has been about privacy. So, for example, we just announced we're having our 3rd Privacy Con, which is a chance for also other academics to come in and talk about issues in privacy, particularly as they relate around technology. So to give that research, drive the discussion forward, and also inform us.
Okay.
James, can I just...
Sure.
Listening to Duane made me realize something. And the other week I was out at PayPal sponsored a symposium with FATF, which is the international group around anti-money laundering and terrorist financing. And I shared similar information that we're talking about today with them, but I also shared a personal observation which I'd like to share with you all, because there's all this conversation about what is fintech, what is regtech, is there a competitive advantage or disadvantage between banks and non-banks in this arena? And when I take a step back and look at this, it feels like 1997 all over again. And for those of you who don't know what that means, if you think back in 1997, I was involved in the internet banking rules that were being drafted and some of the first guidance on that and data security for GLBA. But everybody was scared to death that internet banking was going to eliminate brick and mortar branches in the banking industry. And we had 4 banks that did transactional internet banking, which allowed you to move money from account A to account B within that bank. Today, every bank and many, many financial services companies have transactional internet sites that allow you to move money all over the world from entity to entity, and as we already mentioned, different payment technologies. So we got past that very rapidly, and I see the same environment today. There's all this caution and concern about what it's going to do here, what it's going to do there. But I think it's going to blend very nicely, and the key is going to be collaboration between banks and non-banks, and how you partner to move your business models forward, or how you partner to deliver the right services to the consumers. I don't see either winning or losing. I see if they collaborate and partner, everybody's going to win.
Yeah, well, banks always have in their back pocket that competitive advantage of having a charter. So it's very hard to overcome that if you're trying to disrupt them. So let's turn to privacy and data security, which I think is remains a hot topic across industries, product lines. So let's start with Duane, because it has been a priority. The Trade Commission's been a leader in this area for many years. So I think concrete examples are helpful, like a case study, and the Trade Commission's had multiple enforcement actions using its UDAP authority in this space. So if you could pick one and kind of walk us through it as a case study, with the goal being, what are the takeaways? You know, these are public examples. What can people in the room learn from the example that you have picked for us today?
Sure. Just build on something that Paul said earlier. When you're talking about innovating in financial services, you should always start thinking, you know, you're moving into a regulated space. Certainly, if you're partnering with a bank, you're immediately going to intersect with, you know, the laws that Paul knows more about, dealing with banks. But even if you don't, there's a backdrop of data security and privacy laws that are enforced by the states, but also by the FTC, that have been built up basically through our UDAP authority, which is basically unfair deceptive acts and practices. So the Commission's broadly been concerned with data security and privacy, even outside of the financial realm. But when you're talking about sensitive financial information, obviously the stakes get raised. Before talking a little bit about one case that I'll mention, recently the agency put out some guidance. It's called Start with Security. It's a good tip for innovators in particular who are developing new technologies to start thinking about data security and building it in from the beginning of a product. If you try to build it in at the end, you're going to run into all sorts of problems. But if you are thinking about data security from the beginning, you can draw certain lessons from the various cases that we have. And it really tries to lay that out in a way that I couldn't possibly summarize in 3 minutes, but I think it's a good resource. One case I'll talk about, it's a little bit different from the data security case, but it's something that I'll highlight. It's a case called Sequoia 1, and there's another case called Leap Lab that we brought a few years back, which are about the transfer of sensitive personal or sensitive financial information. In this case, it was bank account numbers, and I think social security numbers, in which a company, obviously, we're in a data-rich environment. Lots of companies out there have access to all sorts of financial data for consumers. And this is a case in which a company that was, I believe, a data broker essentially sold some of that to a company that had no legitimate use for it. The company they sold it to then proceeded to just cram charges, right? They just used it for illegal means. But the data broker knew what was going on, right? It had the sensitive financial information, it transferred it to a bad actor, and then consumers were injured. And we brought a case saying that that was an unfair practice. So I think the lesson learned from that is if you're dealing with the sensitive consumer data, there's just a lot of things you need to think about. Are you protecting it adequately? Are you controlling access from multiple endpoints in your infrastructure? Do you know who you're giving it to? Are you sure that the person that you might be getting this data from or giving it to is a legitimate actor? Things like that that are important to watch out for.
Yeah, the way I think about it is data is transferred quickly and passes a lot of hands. But if something goes wrong when it's not in your hands, if you're part of that chain, there's potential liability. And I think the case law in this area is if you knew or should have known that something bad might happen. I'm kind of simplifying, but that seems to be the prevalent standard in the case law. So that counterparty risk is something that everyone should think about. So turning it over to Paul, tell us a little bit about the OCC's expectations of its supervised institutions and their service providers with respect to cybersecurity.
Sure. So back in '99, I guess right before I finished my last tour as a regulator and left, I was one of the co-authors of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act data security rules. And I think if you haven't heard about it in the room, you you probably just showed up to the fintech space. That was really the first rule that went on the books around managing IT risk and protecting sensitive customer information. And what we keep hearing about are the reapplication of those same elements that are in that data security rule. There hasn't been a whole lot of new guidance or new rules coming out in that area, but clarity around some of them, how to apply them to certain situations. So I always go back to the foundation of what's said in the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act data security rules, and we work from there. And as we think about where we've evolved to, and this is where our agency and the other, the FFIEC, the other banking regulators are focused, is not only on information security or data security now, but also on cybersecurity. Because the threats are coming more rapidly, they're more complex, they have bigger implications. We have extortion now following with threats, so it's affecting payment systems. The scenarios are just getting more and more voluminous and more complex. So we send out constant reminders about how to apply the existing rules and guidance and other best practices that are recognized throughout the industry, because when we wrote the data security rules back in 1999, I like to say we cheated. We went out to the companies that were doing it right, who were protecting data really well, and we looked at those best practices and said, we got to raise the bar and get everybody to do these. So those best practices still apply today, but specifically, we've also added some layers of enhancement. A couple years ago, we launched our cybersecurity assessment tool amongst the FFIEC agencies, the banking regulators, to provide an option to the banks to self-assess what is their risk profile, risk appetite, where are they in terms of their sophistication or maturity, in terms of their security practices around cybersecurity and data security. And it's optional. Banks don't have to use it, but I think it's a missing piece in many places because it helps you create the knowledge of what's your baseline of your data security, cybersecurity practices, and how are we doing as a company and as the culture within our company or our bank managing and improving to that baseline. We use it on our exams, our examiners use it to have conversations with bankers about where are they in that maturity process and the sophistication of their practices. It's not a new mandated piece of guidance, but it's an additional tool that folks can use, and actually we just updated it last month, May, to just add some more clarity around some updates we've been making to other handbooks that we use. As examiners, we have a whole library of information technology and cybersecurity, information security related handbooks that we examine to. If you're not familiar with those, you can get them. They're free at the FFIEC.gov website. And if you're not familiar with them and you're going to engage in financial services or partner with the banking industry, you need to get familiar with them because they're the baseline of what the expectations are, and they're the recognized best practices. We had a SWIFT event, I think, last year, so we've issued some clarifying, again, how the existing guidance applies to payment messaging and payment systems for wholesale payment networks. We've issued some awareness about extortion attempts around cybersecurity. Again, every time these are issued, you can get access to them through the FFIEC.gov website.
All right, so we're short on time and because we want to leave time for Q&A. So this is a quick hitter, 1 minute each for each panelist. Let's look ahead. Pick one thing, each of you, that the audience should look for relating to your respective agencies, especially in light of what I think is still kind of this ongoing political uncertainty, what, if any, impact the new administration may have. So, I know, right, loaded question. So let's start with Paul, and then we'll go to Duane.
So, looking ahead, forward thinking, not what you've read in the paper today, but what you might be reading in the days ahead or weeks ahead. I would say based on the fact that there was an executive order signed in February of this year by the President for the Treasury Secretary to evaluate existing regulations throughout the umbrella of Treasury, you'll see some additional work and discussions and dialogue, a lot of activity around that effort. I think you'll also see when we talk about FinTech and RegTech and responsible innovation, you'll see that OCC is not stepping back from that outreach effort. We see it as a core part of our mission, and it will continue. The message may get refined, it may get tweaked under a new controller coming in, and actually not may, I'm pretty sure it will. And in the coming weeks, you'll probably hear more from our acting controller around that. So, keep an eye out to the press releases and the message that's coming out from either the acting controller or the ultimate controller when he's appointed, he or she's appointed.
I think you're going to continue to see an emphasis from our perspective of identifying areas in which consumers are being harmed and taking steps to remedy that. Consumer injury has always been a big touchstone, as obviously from a consumer protection enforcement standpoint. And basically, generally the advice I like to give to innovators in this space is listen to your consumers. If you're a consumer-focused company and your consumers are having problems, they're being charged, they're being ripped off, their data's not secure, that's a flag that there's something potentially wrong there, and whether or not it's a law violation or not, it's something to try to remedy. And I think we'll continue, as we survey this from an enforcement perspective, looking out to make sure the consumers are not being injured.
All right, thanks. So, I think we have about 9 minutes now for questions, and if I'm not mistaken, there are people in the room with microphones. So please just raise your hand. There's a couple over here. In the back, he was the first one, and then this gentleman in the front, too. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Hi. Okay, thank you. Hi, so Ben Richmond, I'm CEO of Cube. We're a RegTech vendor. So my question is really around how you see the relationship with the RegTech community developing. It's obviously a community that's in its infancy. So there's going to be a lot more vendors that come into this space. That hopefully there'll be lots of success stories. There might be some less than successful experiences. So how do you see that evolving? How do you see it changing in terms of the relationship between RegTech vendors and regulators?
So I'll go first. I agree. It is evolving. I think it's evolving very rapidly. At the FATF event I mentioned at PayPal the other weekend, it was FinTech and RegTech. And usually when I go to these kind of events, I'm hearing the same stories over and over again. It's not a whole lot of new information because we've been leaning into the discussion for so long. But I heard a lot of new conversation, and it was around RegTech, and it was pretty exciting. As an agency at OCC, we're still in the early stages of researching and really understanding the capabilities of RegTech and where it will be a good fit and an important fit. But what I saw and heard from that event, which resonates with me, are areas around customer identification, digital verification of customers, machine learning and artificial intelligence capability around transaction monitoring and monitoring for suspicious activities. And as a private sector, public sector blended perspective, I always look to where the money is, and investors are starting to channel money into this area, just like they are in FinTech. So I expect a lot to be happening there very rapidly, and there's a need for it. That's a very manual-intensive process today with people to do BSA anti-money laundering activities, which are very important. They're paramount today. But the more we can leverage RegTech and other technologies to make that better and more effective and more repeatable, the more success everybody's going to have.
I largely agree with that. I moderated a panel on artificial intelligence at Berkeley a few months ago, and the amount of innovation and the potential to enhance consumers' lives coming out of that kind of technology is, I think, great. So, we as an agency are always trying to hear more about it, and also try to, part of it is just issue spotting. What do we think the consumer issues are going to be? And then we try to message that out so the industry understands, okay, these are the kinds of things to look out for so you don't run into trouble. But I think it's an exciting place for something like, for example, AI to work in a way to help with, like identification issues, reducing fraud, things like that that will be very pro-consumer.
There was a question in the back, yep.
Is on, but perfect. Henry Arslanian, I'm the PwC FinTech and RegTech leader based out of Hong Kong. Quick question, I guess, at the global level, a lot of your other regulators in the world are focusing on the same issues as well, from London to Singapore to India. to what extent you guys are working with them, collaborating to learn for some of the experiences they're having. In certain cases, they're a bit more advanced. So how much collaboration there is. And second quick question is, who is the regulator, in your opinion, a part of yours, who's actually leading when it comes to RegTech, who you look up to, you think is doing some pretty cool stuff in the field? Thank you.
So I'll take the last question, OCC. Sorry, I can only be factual. And the reason I can say that is answering the first part of your question. We are engaged on a global basis. Part of our Office of Innovation strategy is outreach to other regulators, other countries, other bodies throughout the world, as well as domestically and through multiple industries where appropriate. So we're, again, in the early stages. That office only stood up in December of 2016, but they're doing a lot very rapidly, as you would expect from a FinTech, RegTech type office. FATF, for starters, is an organization that we've been involved with for years, from the anti-money laundering, BSA terrorist financing side, which is a global network of agencies and organizations. The observation I heard at that event at PayPal that I've mentioned twice was relief. When they heard that we were still leaning forward on responsible innovation, there was clearly a huge sigh of relief because they were concerned with the change in administration we may be pulling back. And there's no signs of that, and people are very pleased with that. So that's why I answered the other question the way I did. I think that's clearly a sign, but I'm a little prejudiced. So.
I do think that so we do at the FTC. We meet with our counterparts across the globe, sort of in various sorts of fora, to talk about a lot of different issues. I think that you can see, just looking at the public statements of the various regulators and financial services, that they're all making concerted efforts to try to engage with industry and understand the technology as quickly as possible. There is an institutional lag of sorts. We don't have the money to hire the best technologists of the world. We can do our best, bring in a few people, but the industry has a broader reservoir of expertise, particularly when it comes to developing technology. And I think you can see at our agency and others really an openness to hearing the perspective and hearing about the innovation so that we're making responsible decisions.
And if I could just qualify your question, really, the answer is we're all moving forward. Many agencies are moving forward in this direction, and that's the more important message. It's not just one or two. It's definitely a theme that there's a value here and importance of this.
And one thing I will say, a particular interest to me anyway, is what are the tech-neutral way of approaching problems? A lot of what we hear from industry is don't propose a solution that locks you into a certain kind of technology. Instead, have sort of standards so people can meet certain goals, and stuff like that I think is important to have that dialogue.
My 2 cents, since I don't have a dog in the fight, is, and Paul's comment about everyone's interested in it, it's a double-edged sword because everybody's involved in it. And so the challenge in the US compared to, let's say, the UK has a much more consolidated regulatory regime, so you got to deal with one agency. In the US, you've got multiple federal regulators, you've got the states. The states don't always agree with each other. They don't always agree with the feds. The feds don't always agree with each other. They don't always agree with the states. So to get your arms around it, it's difficult and challenging. So I think that is just a continuing reality. And so to get the regulatory perspective, you got to marry what you hear today with what you hear from the states later today to start to piece together the puzzle. But maybe one last question, and then we're done if there are any.
But on that point, we are talking. That's the point. We may not always agree, but that's part of collaboration, right?
Right. With a lawsuit pending.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, well, I guess that's it then. Thank you. On time.
Great. Nice.